الله فأساسا Sh.Muhammad الرحمن طريقتنا الصحبة والخير في الجميع. Allah Azze ve Celle'nin kudreti, azameti insanların akıllarına, hayallerine gelmez.
The greatness and power and might of Allah Almighty is beyond people's understanding and imagination.
Her şeyin onun kudretiyle oluyor.
Everything happens through the will and power of Allah Almighty.
Biz bu yaşıyorsak Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesiyle yaşıyor.
We must know that we live through the will and power of Allah Almighty.
Çünkü öyle bir şeyler var ki en ufak bir şey Allah Azze ve Celle onu istediği vakit harekete geçirse bir tane canlı kalmaz.
If Allah Almighty desired, He could activate one tiny small thing in order to obliterate all of existence.
Ya bir tane insan kalmaz, hayvan kalmaz.
There would be no human, no animal left, nothing.
Onun kudreti, azameti işte bu bütün bu şeylerin içinde yaşayıp da ecel gelince o vakte kadar gitmesi insanın.
We live through the power and might of Allah Almighty, and we have a lifetime that has been predetermined by Allah Almighty, and we will live until we have completed that lifetime, and we will not be leaving this world until our term is over, and it is through the power and might of Allah Almighty through which we live in this life.
Bunları insanlar biz şöyle yapıyoruz, böyle yapıyoruz, bu ilacı bulduk, şu ilacı bulduk diye iftihar ederler.
People are proud of saying that we did this, we did that, we find that cure or we find that medication.
O da Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesiyle oluyor.
But those achievements of humans also happen through the will of Allah Almighty.
İlaç onun şey olmasa, Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesi olmasa fayda vermez.
Without the will of Allah Almighty, medication would not have an impact.
Boş boşuna almış olur.
That medication would have no effect without the will of Allah Almighty.
Onun etkisi Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesiyle oluyor.
The effect of medication comes through the will of Allah Almighty.
Onun için bunu bilmek lazım. Nasıl o vakit derler kafir de alıyor, iyileşiyor, şey yapıyor. O da tabi Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesiyle, muradıyla oluyor.
Everything happens through the will and the desire of Allah Almighty, and also medication is not what gives cure, it is just the means for the manifestation of Allah Almighty's will, and therefore medication may be curing believers as well as disbelievers, but it does not mean that everyone will be cured automatically through medication. Some people get cured, some people don't, and it is only through the will of Allah Almighty who are cured through medication.
Her şeyin bir hikmeti var.
There is a wisdom behind everything.
Allah Azze ve Celle'nin her şeyi bilen Allah Azze ve Celle'dir.
And it is only Him, Allah Almighty, who knows everything.
Bu sistemi Ademoğulları için Allah Azze ve Celle kurmuş.
Allah Almighty has put this system, this way of life into place.
O sistem kıyamete kadar olacak.
And this system, which Allah Almighty put into place for Adam and his descendants, will continue until the last day.
Bazen hasta olacak, bazen iyi, bazen kötü, bazen ilaç fayda verecek, bazen vermeyecek.
And as part of this life and as part of this system and way of life, people undergo ups and downs. Sometimes people are in a good state, sometimes in a bad state. Sometimes they are sick, sometimes they are cured through medication. Sometimes medication helps, sometimes it doesn't. All these things are part of the life which has been predetermined for us through Allah Almighty.
Her şey Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesine. Onu
And everything happens through the will of Allah Almighty.
bilmek lazım.
And this is something we must know.
Onu mümin olan, Müslüman olan ilaç aldığımda iyileştim demesin.
A believer, a mu'min, should not say it was the medication that cured me.
Allah Azze ve Celle murat etti bu ilaca hikmetiyle bize şifa koydu.
A believer should say that it was Allah Almighty who cured me, and it was Allah Almighty who made this medication for me to be the means to be cured, and it was through the wisdom and knowledge of Allah Almighty and through His power that through this means of this medication I was cured.
O ilacı alıp iyileşiyoruz. O ilacın kendisinin değil de Allah Azze ve Celle'nin iradesiyle.
A believer should acknowledge that it is not through that medication that he gets cured, but it is through the will of Allah Almighty who made this medication to be a means to be cured.
Onun için bu hastalıktı, şuydu buydu, onlar Allah Azze ve Celle'nin insanlara ecelde yazdığı şeylerdir. Onlar olacak.
Diseases or other events or situations or circumstances we undergo are things which Allah Almighty has predetermined to happen and which take place through the will of Allah Almighty.
Şimdi o vakit doktora gitmeyelim, ilaç almayalım mı diyor.
Does that mean that we no longer need to see the doctor or that we no longer need to take medication?
Yok, o da alacaksın ama Allah Azze ve Celle'nin tarafından şifa olduğunu bileceksin.
The point here is not to deny the means, but the point here to highlight is that it is not the means that cure us, but it is Allah Almighty who created the means for us to be cured.
Yoksa kafir de alıyor ilacı. Bazen iyileşiyor, iyileşmiyor da. Bazı şeyler var.
Again, a disbeliever may also take medication, and it is not the medication that cures everyone. Some people get cured, some people don't. And it is regardless of that medication, it is through the will of Allah Almighty that medication unfolds its effect.
Mecbur alınması lazım. Onları da alması insan için yapması lazım olan şeylerdir.
And we must accept that everything happens through the will of Allah Almighty, and that means in this life are also a dependency for us, and we cannot deny the dependencies of these means, and we must acknowledge that we must do what is necessary, and that we must resort also to the means which Allah Almighty created for us in order to get cured, such as medication.
Hele bazı şeyler var, onu almasa kendine de zarar verir, başkasına zarar verir.
Because if you deny those means, and if you, for example, do not take medication, then you will not only be harming yourself, but also be harming others.
Onun için onu bilmesi lazım.
This is something we must acknowledge.
Herkesin nasıl duyarsa ilaçta fayda yok deyip de ilacı da bırakıp da şey yaparsa o vakit mesuliyet ona olur.
We will be held accountable for that ignorance if we say that I no longer take medication, I don't need medication. No, medication is a means created by Allah Almighty, and it is then our own fault if we don't get cured because we denied the means of Allah Almighty and if we denied medication.
Tamam, ilaç besmeleyi çekip de şifa olsun diye, bunda şifa yok. Allah'ın kudretine bu şeyde şifa olsun diye niyet edip onu alınca hem Allah Azze ve Celle unutmamış olur.
What is important about medication is that whenever we take it, we must be aware, make ourselves aware that it is not that medication that cures us. And before we take it, we must say the Basmala, remind ourselves of Allah Almighty, and remember Allah Almighty, and make ourselves aware again that it is Allah Almighty who cures us, and this medication is just a means for the manifestation of Allah Almighty's cure.
Aklından çıkarmamış olur.
And in this way, we will always be constantly remembering and reminding ourselves of Allah Almighty, and we will not be forgetting Allah Almighty.
Çünkü her şey Allah Azze ve Celle'nin kudretinden olmuştur.
And we must remember Allah Almighty because everything happens through the power and might of Allah Almighty.
Onun için bazı insanlar tevekkül diye şey yapıyor. Tevekkül edip de başkalarına da zarar vermek olmaz.
We must not deny the means of Allah Almighty and say that this is our trust in Allah Almighty. Trusting in Allah Almighty also means accepting the means of Allah Almighty, and it is not acceptable that by denying the means of Allah Almighty we harm others.
Onu Allah Azze ve Celle bize bu şeyi verdi, imtihanı verdi. Bunları da idare edip de ömrümüzün ne kadarsa
we must accept that the situation we may be undergoing, that it is a test by Allah Almighty, and we must also accept that there are certain means which we must take as part of this test, and we must make the best of our lifetime.
Ondan idare edip Allah'a kavuşuncaya kadar bu dünyanın ilacıyla, hastalığıyla
So we must make the best of our lifetimes and try to pass these tests as good as possible until we reach Allah Almighty. And part of this life is being sick sometimes, and it is being required to take medication.
Geçineceğiz. Allah zikrini unutturmasın.
And therefore we must try to get along in this life as much as possible. But what is important is that we do not forget Allah Almighty, but constantly remember and remind ourselves of Allah Almighty.
Zikir dedi Allah Azze ve Celle unutmamaktır.
What is the meaning of dhikr? It means to not forget Allah Almighty.
Sırf Allah Allah deyip de değil.
Dhikr is not just saying Allah Allah.
Zikir demek Arapça unutmamak.
Dhikr, based on its meaning in Arabic, means to not forget.
Devamlı anmaktır.
To remember and remind oneself.
Her şeyi onun adını anıp onun adıyla her şey iyi olur.
We should remember and remind ourselves of Allah Almighty constantly.
Her iş müyesser olur dedi.
And if you say the name of Allah Almighty in all things, then everything will be successful and good.
Mevlid'de Süleyman Çelebi'nin dediği gibidir.
And as Suleyman Chalabi said in his Mawlid al-Nabi, that it is through the remembrance of Allah Almighty, and it is through praising the name and mentioning the name of Allah Almighty that everything will become good.
ومن الله التوفيق. الفاتحة.